Imagine discovering a family portrait so perfectly composed, so representative of Victorian domestic ideals, that it becomes a treasured example of the era's finest photographic artistry. An image that captures everything beautiful about family life in the 1880s, prosperity, unity, and the ordered happiness of a well-managed household. For nearly 15 years, such a portrait graced the walls of galleries, private collections, and photographic exhibitions across America, becoming an icon of family values and social respectability. But what happens when careful examination reveals that the image is not what it appears to be? That hidden within its perfect composition lies an absence so profound that recognizing it transforms admiration into horror. This is the story of how a single missing figure in a family portrait revealed secrets so dark they challenged everything viewers thought they understood about the nature of memory, identity, and the power of images to preserve or erase the truth. The year was 1884, and in the thriving industrial city of Millfield, Pennsylvania, photography had evolved beyond simple documentation to become a means of establishing social status and family legacy. The wealthy industrialists and merchants who had built fortunes in steel and coal were eager to commission portraits that would preserve their success for future generations, creating visual testaments to their achievements and respectability. Among the most skilled practitioners of this art was Mr. Silas Cunningham, whose studio on Church Street had become the preferred destination for Millfield's elite families. Cunningham possessed an almost supernatural ability to arrange large groups in compositions that appeared natural despite their formal complexity, creating portraits that captured not just individual likenesses, but the essential character of entire family dynasties. His studio occupied the entire second floor of a renovated brick building in the heart of the city's business district, its large windows oriented to capture the perfect northern light that made his portraits so distinctive. The walls displayed dozens of his finest works, formal family groupings that seemed to breathe with life despite the long exposure times required by the photographic technology of the era. But among all these celebrated images, one portrait held a position of special prominence behind Cunningham's desk. The photograph showed the Whitmore family of Elm Street, one of Millfield's most respected households, arranged in what appeared to be their drawing room during an autumn afternoon in 1884. The composition was masterful in its apparent simplicity. Mr. James Whitmore, patriarch of a successful steel manufacturing concern, stood with confident dignity behind a ornate settee where his wife, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, sat with perfect posture in an elaborate blue silk dress. To their left, their eldest son Robert, 22 years old and clearly his father's heir, stood with one hand resting on his mother's shoulder. Their daughter Catherine, 18 and radiant in white lace, sat on a small chair beside the settee, her hands folded gracefully in her lap. The youngest family member, 15-year-old Thomas, stood at the group's right side, his youthful face already showing signs of the strong Whitmore jawline. Everything about the portrait suggested prosperity, stability, and the kind of moral rectitude that Victorian society held as its highest ideal. The family's clothing was expensive but not ostentatious. Their postures conveyed both authority and warmth, and their expressions radiated the confident happiness of people who had found their proper place in the world's natural order. What made this portrait extraordinary was not just its technical perfection, but the way it seemed to capture the essence of what American families aspire to become. The Whitmores appeared to embody every virtue that the growing middle class sought to emulate: financial success balanced with moral character, individual achievement harmonized with family loyalty, and the kind of domestic tranquility that suggested God's blessing on their endeavors. From the moment Cunningham first displayed the portrait in his studio, visitors were invariably impressed by its representation of family excellence. Business associates would pause to admire the image during consultations, commenting on how perfectly it captured the ideals of American family life. Society matrons would study the arrangement of the figures, hoping to replicate such elegant composition in their own family portraits. "It represents everything noble about our modern American family," remarked Mrs. Adelaide Spencer during her first visit to commission a portrait of her own children. Looking at them, one can see the fruits of hard work, moral living, and proper attention to family duties. They appear to be people who understand their responsibilities to both their station and their community. Professor Marcus Thornfield from the local college, a man of scholarly temperament who had made a study of photography as an art form, found himself equally moved by the portrait's apparent perfection. This image demonstrates photography's potential to capture not merely physical appearance, but the moral character of its subjects. The Whitmores radiate the kind of integrity and purpose that built our great nation. Word of the extraordinary portrait spread quickly through Millfield's social circles. Other prominent families began requesting copies for display in their own homes, seeing in the Whitmore portrait an ideal against which to measure their own family achievements. The image became a kind of aspirational template, with parents pointing to it as an example of the dignity and unity their own families should strive to embody. Mr. Jonathan Hartwell, president of the Millfield Commercial Bank, hung a copy in his office where it served as a conversation piece during important business meetings. It reminds visitors of the values that underpin our community's success, he explained to colleagues. When people see what proper family structure and moral character can achieve, it encourages them to pursue similar excellence in their own lives. The portrait's fame spread beyond Millfield's boundaries. Photography exhibitions in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia featured the image as an example of the finest American portrait work. Art critics praised Cunningham's ability to capture what they termed the moral atmosphere of his subjects, using the Whitmore portrait as evidence of photography's evolution from mere mechanical reproduction to genuine artistic expression. As 1884 progressed into 1885, the portrait had become something approaching a cultural phenomenon. Magazines devoted to family life and moral improvement featured engravings based on the photograph, using it to illustrate articles about proper child rearing, the importance of family unity, and the rewards of virtuous living. The Whitmores had become, without their knowledge, symbols of everything admirable about American domestic life. But as the portrait's reputation grew, so too did curiosity about the family it depicted. Visitors to Cunningham's studio began asking about the Whitmores themselves, wondering if the moral excellence apparent in the photograph extended to their daily lives and community involvement. Cunningham's responses to these inquiries were oddly evasive. Where once he had been eager to discuss his most celebrated work, he now seemed uncomfortable when pressed for details about the family or the circumstances of the photographic session. He would deflect questions with vague references to client confidentiality or the private nature of family portraiture. Mrs. Spencer, who had become one of the portrait's most devoted admirers, began to notice subtle changes in Cunningham's demeanor when discussing the image. The photographer, who had once taken evident pride in his masterpiece, now seemed almost haunted by it, often staring at the portrait for long periods with an expression that suggested internal conflict rather than artistic satisfaction. "Sometimes I wonder," Cunningham confided to Mrs. Spencer during one particularly unsettling visit, "whether we truly understand the responsibility that comes with preserving family memories. This portrait has brought acclaim to my studio, but I sometimes question whether certain memories are meant to be preserved exactly as they appear to be." The comment struck Mrs. Spencer as odd, but she attributed it to the artistic temperament that often afflicted creative individuals. Surely Cunningham was simply experiencing the complex emotions that accompanied creating something so universally admired. As 1885 progressed, the portrait continued to serve as an inspiration to families throughout Pennsylvania and beyond. Children grew up seeing the Whitmore family as an example of proper behavior and family loyalty. Young couples began their marriages hoping to achieve the kind of domestic harmony the portrait seemed to represent. The image had become woven into the cultural fabric of American middle-class aspiration. But beneath this surface of universal admiration, something was beginning to trouble those who knew the Whitmore family personally. Longtime residents of Millfield, who had been acquainted with the family for years, began to experience an odd sense of disconnect when viewing the portrait. Though they struggled to articulate exactly what seemed wrong, Mrs. Dorothy Pemberton, who had lived next door to the Whitmores for over a decade, found herself studying the portrait with growing unease during a visit to Cunningham's studio. "It's a beautiful image," she told the photographer, "and it certainly captures the family's dignity and prosperity, but I cannot shake the feeling that something is different about how they appear in the photograph compared to how I remember them in daily life." When pressed to explain her concern, Mrs. Pemberton could only say that the family group seemed smaller than she remembered, though she admitted this might simply be the effect of formal posing compared to the casual interactions she typically observed in their daily routines. Similar comments began to surface among other long-time acquaintances of the family. People would look at the portrait and remark that it seemed somehow incomplete, though they could not identify what might be missing from what appeared to be a perfectly composed family grouping. Dr. William Morrison, the family physician who had served the Whitmores for many years, experienced perhaps the strongest sense of disquiet when viewing the portrait. During a consultation with Cunningham about commissioning a portrait of his own family, he found himself staring at the Whitmore image with profound confusion. "I have known this family intimately for nearly 15 years, he told Cunningham, and while this is certainly a masterful portrait, I cannot escape the feeling that it does not quite match my memory of their family composition. Yet when I try to identify what might be different, I find myself unable to articulate the source of my concern." These scattered expressions of unease might have remained nothing more than curious footnotes to the portrait's success, except that they followed a pattern that suggested something more systematic than simple misremembering. Multiple people who had known the family well were experiencing similar feelings of wrongness when viewing the image, even though none could identify a specific error or omission. Cunningham himself began to manifest signs of increasing distress as these comments accumulated. His notebook entries from this period, discovered after his death, reveal a mind grappling with doubts and fears that had no obvious rational basis. March 15th, 1885. Mrs. Pemberton visited today and made the same comment that several others have offered, that the family portrait appears somehow smaller than she remembered. I have examined the image countless times and can find no technical flaws or compositional errors. Yet I cannot dismiss the growing sense that something about the portrait troubles even me, its creator. March 22nd, 1885. Dr. Morrison's visit today has left me deeply unsettled. His certainty that something is wrong with the family grouping, combined with his inability to identify what that might be, mirrors my own growing unease with the image that has brought me such professional success. Why would multiple people experience the same vague sense of incompleteness when viewing a portrait that appears technically perfect? March 29th, 1885. I have been reviewing my original session notes and find certain details that puzzle me. The photographic session took longer than usual, and my notes mention several false starts and repositioning of subjects, but I cannot recall the specific reasons for these delays, nor can I find detailed records of the adjustments that were made. The growing tension between the portrait's public acclaim and the private doubts of those who knew the family personally was approaching a crisis point. The image that had brought such professional success to Cunningham was beginning to torment him with questions he could not answer and doubts he could not dismiss. The stage was set for revelations that would transform the most celebrated family portrait in Pennsylvania into something far more sinister. The picture that had represented the pinnacle of domestic virtue was about to reveal secrets that would challenge everything viewers thought they understood about the nature of family, memory, and the power of photography to preserve or distort the truth. As spring turned to summer in 1885, Silas Cunningham found himself staring at his masterpiece with increasing frequency and growing horror, as if seeing it clearly for the first time. The perfect family portrait that had defined his career was about to reveal that sometimes the most important truths are found not in what is present in an image, but in recognizing what has been carefully, deliberately, and impossibly removed. The ordinary family portrait was about to expose an extraordinary secret, and nothing in Millfield would ever be the same again. The revelation that would forever change how people understood the Whitmore family portrait came not through dramatic confrontation, but through the patient detective work of someone trained to notice details others might miss. Mrs. Helen Ashford, Millfield's head librarian and a woman whose profession had taught her the importance of careful documentation, made the discovery that would transform admiration into horror during what should have been a routine research project. In the summer of 1885, Mrs. Ashford was compiling a comprehensive record of Millfield's prominent families for the upcoming centennial celebration. Her project required examining birth records, obituaries, society page mentions, and any other documentation that might illuminate the growth and development of the community's leading households. The Whitmore family, given their prominence and the fame of their portrait, naturally warranted detailed attention. It was while cross-referencing census records from 1880 with more recent church registry entries that Mrs. Ashford first noticed the discrepancy that would unravel everything. According to the federal census taken 4 years earlier, the Whitmore household had consisted of 6 members: James and Eleanor Whitmore, their children Robert, Catherine, Thomas, and a daughter named Margaret, who would have been 13 years old at the time of the portrait session. Mrs. Ashford's initial assumption was that young Margaret had died between the census and the portrait. and that the family had chosen not to include any memorial to their lost daughter in their formal photograph. Such decisions were not uncommon. Some families prefer to remember deceased children through separate memorial portraits rather than incorporating remembrances into images meant to celebrate living family members. But when Mrs. Ashford searched through local obituary records, church burial registries, and physicians' reports, she found no evidence that Margaret Whitmore had died. Indeed, she could find no mention of the girl's death anywhere in the extensive documentation that small communities typically maintained about their prominent families. Puzzled by this apparent oversight in the record-keeping, Mrs. Ashford decided to approach the mystery more systematically. She began interviewing long-time residents of Millfield, particularly those who had been neighbors or social acquaintances of the Whitmore family during the early 1880s. What she discovered was far more disturbing than a simple case of incomplete records. Mrs. Dorothy Pemberton, the Whitmore's next-door neighbor, initially responded to Mrs. Ashford's inquiries with the same vague sense of unease she had expressed about the family portrait. "You know, now that you mention it, I do seem to recall that there was another child," Mrs. Pemberton said slowly, as if the memory was emerging from some deep, forgotten place. "A girl, younger than Catherine but older than Thomas. But it's the strangest thing. When I try to remember her clearly, the details seem to slip away from me." Similar conversations with other long-time residents revealed the same disturbing pattern. People had dim, uncertain recollections of a sixth family member, a girl they described as quiet, perhaps delicate, someone who had been present in their peripheral awareness but who had never made a strong impression. Yet none could recall her name, her appearance, or what had become of her. Dr. William Morrison, when directly questioned about his medical records, experienced what he could only describe as a form of selective amnesia. "I have served as the Whitmore family physician for 15 years, he told Mrs. Ashford, clearly distressed by his own inability to provide clear information. "I should have comprehensive medical records for every family member, yet when I search my files for documentation of a sixth child, I find nothing. Not birth records, not vaccination documentation, not treatment notes, nothing at all." But then he paused, his face growing pale as he struggled with half-formed memories. "Yet I have the strongest feeling that I should have such records. There are gaps in my documentation that suggest something. Medical expenses that don't quite align with the treatments I recorded. Consultation fees that exceed what I would have charged for the family members I can clearly remember treating." Mrs. Ashford's investigation took on an increasingly urgent quality as she realized she was uncovering not simply missing records, but evidence of systematic memory loss affecting everyone who had known the family during the relevant time period. It was as if an entire person had been carefully, selectively erased from the collective consciousness of Millfield's population. The breakthrough came when Mrs. Ashford gained access to the Whitmore family's private correspondence, which had been donated to the library's historical collection following Eleanor Whitmore's death the previous year. Hidden among letters discussing household management, business affairs, and social obligations, she found references that confirmed her growing suspicions. In a letter dated March 1883, Eleanor Whitmore had written to her sister in Philadelphia, "Margaret's condition continues to cause us considerable concern. The physicians we have consulted offer little hope for improvement, and James has begun to speak of alternatives that I find too distressing to contemplate. The other children ask fewer questions now, though I suspect they understand more than we would wish." Another letter, dated October 1883, was even more revealing. "We have made the decision that James insisted was necessary. Though my heart breaks at the thought, Margaret will be better cared for at the institution than we could manage at home, and the other children will be spared the continuing distress of witnessing her deterioration. We have told them that she has gone to stay with relatives, and in time, perhaps that fiction will become easier to bear than the truth." The final piece of evidence was found in a letter dated April 1884, just 1 month before the portrait session. "The decision has been made final. Dr. Morrison has assisted with the arrangements, though I suspect the process has been as difficult for him as for us. Margaret will be remembered as we choose to remember her, and the family will present itself as circumstances now require. James believes this is the kindest solution for everyone involved." Armed with this documentation, Mrs. Ashford confronted Dr. Morrison with evidence that he had been involved in some form of systematic deception regarding Margaret Whitmore's fate. Under pressure, the physician finally admitted to participating in what he called a conspiracy of therapeutic forgetting. Margaret Whitmore suffered from what we would now recognize as a severe developmental condition, Dr. Morrison revealed. His voice heavy with shame and grief. She was unable to speak, required constant care, and displayed behaviors that the family found increasingly difficult to manage. In 1883, when she was 12 years old, her parents made the decision to commit her to the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane. The revelation struck Mrs. Ashford like a physical blow. The missing family member was not dead. She had been institutionalized and then systematically erased from family memory and community awareness. But that explains only her physical absence, Mrs. Ashford pointed out. How do you account for the fact that people seem unable to remember her clearly, as if their very memories have been altered? Dr. Morrison's response revealed the full scope of the deception that had been perpetrated. James Whitmore was a man of considerable influence and resources, the physician explained. He believed that Margaret's condition reflected poorly on the family's genetic fitness and social standing. He conceived a plan to not merely remove her from the household, but to eliminate all evidence of her existence entirely. The plan, as Dr. Morrison described it, had been implemented with chilling systematic precision. Medical records had been altered or destroyed. Birth registrations had been modified. Church baptismal records had been changed. School enrollment documents had been amended. Every official trace of Margaret Whitmore's existence had been carefully eliminated. But even more disturbing was the psychological component of the deception. James Whitmore consulted with specialists in what was then called therapeutic suggestion, Dr. Morrison revealed. Using techniques borrowed from the emerging field of hypnosis and mental influence, he arranged for systematic sessions with every person in Millfield who had significant contact with the family. Neighbors, servants, business associates, medical professionals, all of us were subjected to procedures designed to blur and eventually erase our memories of Margaret's existence. The process had not been completely successful, which explained why people retained vague feelings of unease when viewing the family portrait. Their unconscious minds retained traces of memory about the missing family member, but their conscious recollection had been systematically suppressed. The portrait session was the final step in the process, Dr. Morrison continued. Cunningham was instructed to photograph the family as it now existed, creating a definitive visual record that would replace any lingering memories of the previous family composition. The resulting image would become the authoritative representation of the Whitmore family, making it easier for people to accept the revised version of reality. Mrs. Ashford realized she was confronting evidence of what amounted to a systematic campaign to erase a human being from existence, not through murder, but through the more insidious method of destroying all evidence that she had ever lived. Margaret Whitmore had been transformed from a living person into what amounted to a non-person, someone who existed in no official records and whose memory had been deliberately suppressed in the minds of everyone who had known her. The psychological impact of this revelation was devastating for everyone involved in the cover-up. As Dr. Morrison's confession spread through the community, people began to experience what amounted to a collective psychological awakening. The suppressed memories of Margaret Whitmore started to resurface, often accompanied by profound feelings of guilt and horror at their complicity in her erasure. Mrs. Pemberton, the Whitmore's former neighbor, was among the first to recover clear memories of the missing child. She was such a quiet girl, she wept during her conversation with Mrs. Ashford. She would sit in the garden behind their house, always alone, always so still. She never spoke, but her eyes were so intelligent, so aware. How could we have forgotten her? How could we have allowed her to be erased as if she had never mattered at all? The recovery of these suppressed memories created a cascade of psychological trauma throughout Millfield's social elite. People who had participated in the therapeutic suggestion sessions began to remember not only Margaret herself, but the process by which their memories had been altered. They recalled sitting in darkened rooms while mysterious practitioners used hypnotic techniques to convince them that their memories were false, that the sixth Whitmore child had never existed. The famous family portrait, once celebrated as a masterpiece of domestic virtue, now appeared to viewers in its true light, as the final piece of evidence in a systematic campaign to erase a developmentally disabled child from history. The apparent perfection of the family composition was revealed as artificial, achieved through the deliberate exclusion of a family member whose condition was deemed incompatible with the image of success and respectability the family wished to project. Silas Cunningham, confronted with evidence of his role in the deception, suffered what amounted to a complete nervous breakdown. In his final notebook entry before his hospitalization, he wrote, "I have spent my career believing that photography captures truth, that it preserves reality for future generations to witness and understand. But I have learned that images can lie as effectively as words, and that the most profound deceptions are often achieved not by adding false elements to a composition, but by carefully removing elements that are inconvenient to acknowledge. I have helped create a monument to family pride built on the foundation of a child's erasure, and I fear that no amount of confession or repentance can undo the evil I have participated in." The scandal that emerged from Mrs. Ashford's investigation destroyed the reputation of everyone involved in the cover-up. James Whitmore, once respected as a leader of industry and a pillar of the community, became a pariah whose business interests collapsed under the weight of public disgust. The other family members, who had been willing participants in Margaret's erasure, found themselves ostracized from the social circles they had once dominated. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the entire affair was the fate of Margaret herself. When Mrs. Ashford attempted to locate the missing girl at the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane, she discovered that Margaret Whitmore had died in 1884, just months after her institutionalization. She had died alone, forgotten by her family, and erased from the memory of everyone who had ever known her. The official cause of death was listed as general debility, but the hospital records painted a picture of a child who had simply given up living after being abandoned by everyone who should have loved and protected her. She had been buried in the institution's unmarked cemetery, with no stone to mark her passing and no family members present to mourn her death. The portrait that had once celebrated family virtue was revealed as a monument to family shame, its apparent perfection achieved through the systematic elimination of inconvenient truth. The missing family member was not absent due to death or circumstance, but because her very existence had been deemed incompatible with the image of success and respectability her family wished to project to the world. The ordinary family portrait had revealed an extraordinary evil, and the community that had once celebrated it as an example of domestic virtue now recoiled from it in horror, understanding finally that sometimes the most important truths about a family are found in recognizing who has been deliberately, carefully, and cruelly excluded from the picture. In the months following Mrs. Ashford's devastating revelations about Margaret Whitmore's deliberate erasure, the town of Millfield found itself grappling with a crisis that went far beyond simple scandal. The systematic removal of a disabled child from family and community memory had created psychological wounds that proved resistant to conventional healing, and the after effects of the mass hypnotic manipulation began manifesting in ways that challenged the community's understanding of memory, reality, and moral responsibility. Dr. William Morrison, whose confession had confirmed the scope of the deception, found himself at the center of what medical authorities were beginning to recognize as an unprecedented case of collective psychological trauma. The therapeutic suggestion sessions that had been used to erase Margaret Whitmore from community memory had not simply suppressed specific recollections, they had fundamentally altered the participants' relationship with their own capacity for accurate remembrance. As people began to recover their suppressed memories of Margaret, many experienced what Dr. Morrison termed cascading recollection syndrome. The return of one set of erased memories triggered the recovery of others, revealing that the Whitmore case was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of systematic reality manipulation that had been occurring in Millfield for years. Mrs. Dorothy Pemberton, whose recovered memories of Margaret had been among the clearest, found herself remembering other instances of inexplicable forgetting that had affected the community. During one particularly disturbing session with Dr. Morrison, she recalled a family called the Hendersons who had lived on Oak Street during the early 1880s. They had a son who was born with physical deformities, she said, her voice shaking as the memory surfaced. The boy was perhaps 14 or 15 years old when the family suddenly claimed he had died in an accident. But now I remember, there was no funeral, no burial, no body. He simply vanished, and we all accepted the family's explanation without question, as if our ability to think critically about the situation had been somehow suspended. Similar cases began surfacing as more residents underwent the painful process of memory recovery. The Blackwood family had eliminated a daughter who suffered from epileptic seizures. The Warners had erased a son who displayed what would now be recognized as symptoms of autism. The Caldwells had removed from family history a child who had been born with a cleft palate and associated developmental delays. In each case, the pattern was identical. Wealthy families had used their resources to institutionalize children whose conditions were deemed incompatible with social respectability, then employed systematic memory manipulation to eliminate all traces of the children's existence from community consciousness. The portrait sessions that followed each erasure served as psychological anchors, providing visual confirmation of the revised family compositions and making it easier for people to accept the altered versions of reality. Mrs. Ashford's investigation revealed that Millfield had become the site of what amounted to a systematic campaign of genetic cleansing, with prominent families working together to eliminate evidence of hereditary conditions that might threaten their social standing. The techniques they employed were more sophisticated than simple cover-up. They constituted a coordinated assault on the community's collective memory and sense of reality. The psychological implications of these discoveries were staggering. Dr. Morrison found himself treating dozens of residents who were experiencing what he termed ontological vertigo, a profound disorientation caused by the discovery that their memories and perceptions had been systematically manipulated without their knowledge or consent. The human mind depends on the reliability of memory to maintain a coherent sense of self and reality, he wrote in his clinical notes. When people discover that their most basic recollections have been artificially altered, they lose confidence in their ability to distinguish between authentic experience and implanted suggestion. The result is a kind of psychological freefall in which nothing can be trusted as genuinely real. The effects were particularly severe among those who had been closest to the erased children. Teachers who had forgotten students they had once taught experienced profound guilt when their memories returned. Neighbors who had accepted impossible explanations without question tormented themselves with the knowledge of their complicity. Even family members who had participated in the erasure campaigns found themselves psychologically shattered by the recovery of their suppressed recollections. Robert Whitmore, the eldest son who had stood so confidently in the family portrait, was among those most severely affected by the return of his erased memories. When confronted with evidence of his sister Margaret's existence and fate, he experienced what amounted to a complete psychological collapse. "I remember her now," he told Mrs. Ashford during one of their meetings. "I remember how she would rock back and forth in her chair by the window, humming tuneless songs that only she could understand. I remember how mother would weep after putting her to bed each night, and how father would grow angry whenever anyone mentioned her condition in public." But what tormented Robert most was not simply the recovery of his memories of Margaret, but the realization of his own complicity in her erasure. "I knew what was happening," he continued, his voice breaking. "When they told us she had gone to live with relatives, I knew it was a lie. When the strange doctors came to our house and made us sit in dark rooms while they spoke to us in soothing voices, I understood that they were changing something fundamental about how we remembered our family. But I wanted to forget her. I wanted to believe that we could be the perfect family that everyone expected us to be." The moral implications of the Whitmore case and its associated revelations created a crisis of conscience that extended far beyond Millfield's boundaries. When news of the systematic memory manipulation spread to other communities, similar cases began surfacing across Pennsylvania and neighboring states. It appeared that the techniques pioneered in Millfield had been exported to other locations, creating a network of communities where inconvenient family members had been systematically erased from existence. The medical and legal establishments struggled to respond to crimes that had no precedent in law or professional ethics. How could society prosecute cases of murder when no bodies had been found and no deaths had officially occurred? How could courts address the theft of memory when the victims had been convinced that their altered recollections were authentic? How could communities heal from trauma when the very nature of that trauma challenged fundamental assumptions about the reliability of human perception and memory? Religious leaders found themselves confronting theological questions that had no easy answers. If human identity was grounded in being remembered by God and community, what happened to the souls of children who had been systematically erased from all human memory? Were the erased children truly dead if their spirits lived on in some form, waiting to be remembered and acknowledged? Did the systematic erasure of human beings constitute a form of spiritual murder that transcended physical death? Father Michael O'Sullivan, pastor of St. Mary's Catholic Church, attempted to address these questions in a series of sermons that became famous throughout the region. We have learned, he told his congregation, that it is possible to commit murder without taking life, to destroy a human soul by destroying all evidence that it ever existed. The children who were erased from our memories were not merely hidden away, they were subjected to a form of spiritual annihilation that may be more cruel than physical death. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire crisis was the discovery that the memory manipulation techniques had not been entirely successful. Children throughout Millfield and surrounding communities began reporting encounters with figures they described as forgotten children, ghostly presences who appeared in their dreams and sometimes in waking visions, pleading to be remembered and acknowledged. 8-year-old Timothy Patterson was among the first to report such encounters. According to his parents, Timothy began having dreams about a girl who looked similar to the Whitmore children, but who seemed somehow different, quieter, sadder, more fragile than the confident family members depicted in the famous portrait. She tells me her name is Margaret, Timothy reported to his parents. She says she used to live in the big house on Elm Street, but everyone forgot about her. She's lonely because no one remembers her anymore, and she wants people to know that she was real. Similar reports began coming from children throughout the region. The descriptions they provided of their dream visitors corresponded remarkably closely to the few surviving records of the erased children, including details that the young witnesses could not have known through normal means. Dr. Morrison, despite his own complicity in the original cover-up, began documenting these encounters with scientific rigor. His investigation revealed patterns that suggested something beyond simple coincidence or childhood imagination. The children who report these encounters provide remarkably consistent descriptions of individuals whose existence has been systematically erased from official records, he wrote. They describe physical characteristics, personality traits, and even specific incidents that align closely with the fragmentary evidence we have recovered about the forgotten children. The consistency and detail of these reports suggest that we may be dealing with phenomena that transcend conventional psychological explanation. The encounters were not limited to dreams. Several children reported meeting the forgotten ones during waking hours, usually in liminal spaces like attics, basements, or unused rooms where the boundary between memory and reality seemed most permeable. These meetings followed a consistent pattern. The erased children would appear to their young visitors, tell them stories about their lives and their families, and beg to be remembered and acknowledged. Most disturbing of all were the reports from children who claimed the forgotten ones were teaching them about other erased individuals, children from other families, other communities, other campaigns of systematic forgetting that had never been discovered or acknowledged. There are so many of us, one forgotten child reportedly told her young visitor. In every town, in every family that wants to be perfect, there are children like me who are judged unworthy of being remembered. We exist in the spaces between what people choose to remember and what they choose to forget. And we will continue to exist there until someone acknowledges that we were real. The psychological impact of these encounters on the children who experienced them was severe. Many began displaying symptoms of what Dr. Morrison termed survivor guilt by proxy, profound distress at being remembered and acknowledged while others had been forgotten and erased. The psychological impact of these encounters on the children who experienced them was severe. Many began displaying symptoms of what Dr. Morrison termed survivor guilt by proxy, profound distress at being remembered and acknowledged while others had been forgotten and erased. Some refused to have their own portraits taken, fearing that the process might somehow make them vulnerable to being erased if they were ever deemed imperfect or inconvenient. The crisis deepened when several families reported that their children had begun deliberately injuring or disfiguring themselves, apparently believing that if they made themselves imperfect, like the forgotten children, they might be able to see and communicate with them more effectively. Parents throughout Millfield found themselves dealing with children who had become obsessed with the concept of being forgotten, some expressing the desire to be erased themselves rather than live with the knowledge of what had been done to others. Mrs. Ashford, whose investigation had uncovered the systematic erasure campaign, found herself at the center of a community-wide trauma that seemed to be growing rather than healing. The more people learned about the extent of the memory manipulation, the more they questioned the authenticity of their own recollections and experiences. We have opened a door that perhaps should have remained closed, she wrote in her private journal, in seeking to restore the memory of the forgotten children. We have destabilized the entire community's relationship with reality itself. People no longer trust their own minds, their own memories, their own perceptions. We have traded the specific horror of erased children for the general horror of universal doubt about the nature of truth itself. The situation reached its most critical point when investigators discovered that the memory manipulation techniques had been used not only to erase inconvenient children, but to implant false memories that served the interests of Millfield's elite families. People began remembering charitable acts that had never occurred, business dealings that had been more generous than they actually were, and social interactions that painted the prominent families in more favorable lights than reality had warranted. The revelation that their positive memories of the community's leaders were as artificial as their forgotten memories of the erased children created a complete breakdown in social trust. Citizens began questioning every interaction they had ever had with authority figures, wondering which of their experiences were genuine and which had been carefully crafted through psychological manipulation. Dr. Morrison, overwhelmed by the scope of the crisis he had helped create, made a desperate decision to attempt a radical intervention. Working with specialists in hypnosis and memory recovery, he proposed a community-wide process of systematic memory restoration that would attempt to undo all the artificial alterations and return people's recollections to their original, unmanipulated state. We must face the possibility, he announced to a gathering of community leaders, that the only way to heal from this crisis is to experience the full truth of what was done, regardless of how painful that truth might be. We must recover not only our memories of the forgotten children, but our authentic memories of everything that was changed to serve the interests of those who sought to reshape reality according to their preferences. The process that followed would become known as the Great Remembering, a systematic attempt to restore authentic memory to an entire community that had been subjected to decades of psychological manipulation. The procedures were conducted in groups, with participants supporting each other as they recovered increasingly disturbing memories of complicity, deception, and moral compromise. As the artificial memories fell away and authentic recollections returned, the full scope of the horror became clear. The systematic erasure of disabled children had been only the most dramatic example of a broader campaign to reshape social reality according to the preferences of a small group of wealthy families. Elections had been influenced through implanted memories of candidate qualifications. Business dealings had been obscured through artificial recollections of fair treatment. Even marriages and social relationships had been manipulated through carefully crafted false memories of romantic attraction and social compatibility. The community that emerged from the Great Remembering was fundamentally different from the one that had entered it. People who had lived their entire lives believing in artificial versions of reality found themselves confronting authentic memories that were often painful, complicated, and morally ambiguous. The comfortable certainties that had defined Millfield's social structure dissolved as residents recognized how thoroughly their perceptions had been manipulated. But perhaps most significantly, the recovery of authentic memory allowed the community to properly acknowledge and mourn the children who had been erased from their recollections. Memorial services were held for Margaret Whitmore and the other forgotten children, creating the public recognition and remembrance that had been deliberately denied to them during their lives. The famous family portrait that had started the entire crisis was finally recognized for what it truly was, not a celebration of family virtue, but a monument to family shame and community complicity in systematic oppression. The image that had once hung in places of honor was removed to storage, though some argued it should be displayed as a permanent reminder of the dangers of allowing social pressure to override moral responsibility. As 1886 drew to a close, Millfield was beginning the long process of rebuilding its social institutions on a foundation of authentic rather than manipulated memory. The crisis had taught the community that the price of false perfection was the erasure of human dignity, and that any society built on systematic forgetting would ultimately destroy itself through the contradictions inherent in denying reality. But what they did not yet understand was that the process of remembering the forgotten children would awaken forces that transcended the boundaries between life and death, memory and reality, bringing consequences that would challenge everything they thought they knew about existence itself. The winter of 1887 brought to Millfield not the peace that might have been expected after the Great Remembering, but rather a new and more complex form of crisis. As the community struggled to rebuild its social institutions on a foundation of authentic rather than manipulated memory, It became clear that the systematic erasure of the forgotten children had created consequences that extended far beyond the realm of human psychology and into areas that challenged conventional understanding of life, death, and the nature of existence itself. Dr. Morrison, whose attempts at community-wide memory restoration had been partially successful, found himself confronting phenomena that defied medical explanation. The children who had been reporting encounters with the forgotten ones were now describing interactions that seemed to be growing more frequent and more substantial, as if the process of remembering the erased children was somehow allowing them to become more present in the physical world. The most dramatic manifestation occurred in the Whitmore mansion on Elm Street, which had stood empty since the family's disgrace and departure from Millfield. Neighbors began reporting that lights could be seen moving through the house at night, despite the fact that the property had been sealed and no one had legal access to the interior. More disturbing still were the reports of children's voices singing lullabies that could be heard drifting from the upper floors, particularly from what had once been Margaret Whitmore's bedroom. Mrs. Pemberton, the former neighbor whose recovered memories had been among the clearest, was the first to witness what appeared to be a direct physical manifestation of one of the forgotten children. During a late evening walk past the Whitmore property, she reported seeing a pale figure in a white dress standing at Margaret's former bedroom window, looking out at the street with an expression of profound sadness. It was definitely Margaret, she told Dr. Morrison the following day. She looked exactly as I now remember her, perhaps 13 years old, with dark hair and the distinctive Whitmore features, but so much thinner and more fragile than her siblings. When she saw me looking up at her, she raised her hand as if to wave, and I could swear I heard her voice calling my name. Similar sightings began occurring throughout Millfield, with multiple residents reporting encounters with children they now recognized as the victims of the systematic erasure campaign. These manifestations followed patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose rather than mere psychological projection or mass hallucination. The forgotten children appeared most frequently to adults who had participated in their erasure, seeking not revenge but acknowledgement. They would manifest during moments when these individuals were alone, engaging them in conversations about their lives, their treatment, and their continued existence in the liminal space between memory and forgetting. Robert Whitmore, who had returned to Millfield in an attempt to make amends for his family's crimes, reported the most extensive contact with his erased sister. According to his detailed account, Margaret began visiting him nightly, appearing in his rented rooms to tell him about her experiences after being institutionalized and erased from family memory. She explains that dying was not the end for her, Robert told Dr. Morrison during one of their sessions. Because we had erased her from human memory while she was still alive, her death did not complete the natural process of letting go and moving on. She became trapped in a state between life and death, unable to rest because no one remembered her existence, unable to truly live because her physical form had perished. Margaret's accounts, as related through Robert, provided disturbing insights into the experiences of all the forgotten children. According to her testimony, the systematic erasure of their existence had created a form of spiritual imprisonment that transcended physical death. They existed in a realm where they retained consciousness and memory, but lacked the ability to interact meaningfully with the physical world until someone in that world remembered them clearly enough to bridge the gap between dimensions. "We have been waiting," Margaret reportedly told her brother, "for someone to remember us truly, completely, without the artificial barriers that were placed in people's minds. Now that the false memories are being removed and authentic recollections are returning, we can make ourselves known to those who wronged us and seek the acknowledgement that was denied to us in life." The implications of these revelations were staggering for both the individuals involved and the community as a whole. If the forgotten children had indeed survived death in some form, trapped in a liminal existence by the very memory manipulation that had erased them from life, then the crimes committed against them extended far beyond simple institutional abuse into realms of spiritual violation that had no precedent in law or theology. Father O'Sullivan, who had been struggling with the theological implications of the erasure campaign, found in these manifestations confirmation of his worst fears about the spiritual dimensions of the crimes. "We have learned that it is possible to so thoroughly violate the natural order of existence that we can trap human souls in states of perpetual suffering," he told his congregation during a sermon that would be remembered for decades. The systematic erasure of these children from human memory created a form of purgatory from which they could not escape, even through death. We face not merely the temporal consequences of our moral failures, but eternal ones that may require generations to fully address. The manifestations were not limited to individual encounters. Several residents reported group sightings in which multiple forgotten children appeared together, usually in locations where they had once played or spent time during their lives. These gatherings seemed to serve a purpose beyond simple haunting. The children appeared to be teaching each other, sharing information about their experiences, and coordinating their efforts to make their existence known to the living world. Most disturbing of all were the reports from current children in Millfield, who claimed that the forgotten ones were recruiting them to serve as intermediaries between the realm of the erased and the world of the remembered. These living children began displaying knowledge and abilities that their parents found deeply unsettling, including the capacity to communicate with deceased individuals and to perceive aspects of reality that remained invisible to adult observers. 8-year-old Timothy Patterson, who had been among the first to report contact with the forgotten children, began serving as an unofficial spokesperson for their collective concerns. During sessions with Dr. Morrison, Timothy would relay detailed messages from the erased children about their current condition and their requirements for achieving peace. They want people to know that erasing someone from memory doesn't make them go away, Timothy reported. It just makes them exist in a place where they can see everything but can't make anyone see them. They've been watching their families for years, seeing how much happier everyone became after forgetting about them. And it makes them very sad. But the forgotten children's messages were not simply pleas for sympathy. According to Timothy and other child intermediaries, the erased ones had developed a sophisticated understanding of the memory manipulation techniques that had been used against them, and they were now using similar methods to influence the thoughts and dreams of living individuals. Margaret says they've learned how to plant memories, just like the doctors who made people forget them, Timothy reported during one particularly disturbing session. She says they can make people remember things that didn't happen, or forget things that did happen. She says they've been practicing on the people who hurt them, making them have nightmares and forget happy things to show them what it feels like to have your memories controlled by someone else. The revelation that the forgotten children had developed the ability to manipulate memory and perception created panic among the adults who had been involved in their original erasure. People began reporting disturbing dreams in which they relived the children's institutionalization and death from the perspective of the victims themselves. Others found that their pleasant memories were becoming dim and unclear, while traumatic recollections grew more vivid and intrusive. Dr. Morrison realized that the community was facing a crisis that went far beyond psychological healing or social reconciliation. The forgotten children had become active agents in their own right, using supernatural abilities to seek something that transcended simple justice or acknowledgement. They were reshaping reality according to their own understanding of right and wrong, and their methods were proving to be as systematic and ruthless as those that had been used against them. The situation reached its climax during the winter solstice of 1887, when all the forgotten children throughout Millfield manifested simultaneously in what witnesses described as a conclave of the erased. The gathering took place in the town square at midnight, with dozens of ghostly figures appearing under the full moon to address the living community that had denied their existence. Margaret Whitmore served as the primary spokesperson for the collective, her voice carrying clearly through the cold night air as she delivered what amounted to a formal judgment upon the community that had erased her and her fellow victims. "We have existed in the spaces between your memories and your guilt for years beyond counting," she declared to the crowd of living witnesses who had gathered to observe the unprecedented manifestation. "We have watched you celebrate your perfect families while we suffered in institutions and unmarked graves. We have seen you prosper through lies, while we were denied even the dignity of being mourned." The forgotten children's demands, as articulated through Margaret, were both simple and impossible to fulfill. They wanted to be fully restored to the living world, with their erasure undone not just in memory, but in physical reality. They wanted their families to acknowledge not just that they had existed, but that their existence had been valuable and worthy of love despite their disabilities and differences. "We do not seek revenge," Margaret continued, "but we demand resurrection, not merely the restoration of memory, but the restoration of life itself. You have learned to manipulate memory and perception. Now you must learn to manipulate reality itself to undo the injustices you have perpetrated." The impossibility of these demands created a deadlock that threatened to trap Millfield in a cycle of supernatural conflict that could last for generations. The Forgotten Children clearly possessed the power to make life increasingly difficult for the living community, but the living lacked the ability to grant the kind of complete restoration that the erased ones sought. The resolution came through an unexpected source: the current children of Millfield, who had been serving as intermediaries between the two realms. Led by Timothy Patterson and several other young people who had developed strong connections with the Forgotten Ones, they proposed a solution that addressed the spiritual needs of both the living and the erased. Rather than attempting to undo the erasure through impossible restoration to physical life, the living children suggested creating a permanent memorial that would serve as an anchor point between the two realms. This memorial would not simply remember the forgotten children, but would provide them with a means of continuing to exist in relationship with the living world without being trapped in the liminal space they currently occupied. The memorial that was eventually constructed became known as the Garden of Remembrance, a carefully designed space where the forgotten children could manifest safely and maintain ongoing relationships with living family members and community members. The garden included individual markers for each erased child, containing not just their names and dates, but detailed accounts of their lives, their personalities, and the circumstances of their erasure and death. Most significantly, the garden was designed as a living space where the forgotten children could continue to grow and develop despite their physical absence. Through the mediation of sympathetic living children, they could participate in community events, offer guidance and comfort to troubled individuals, and maintain the kinds of family relationships that had been denied to them during their physical lives. The creation of the Garden of Remembrance marked the beginning of a new chapter in Millfield's history, one in which the boundary between life and death became more permeable and the community learned to acknowledge forms of existence that transcended traditional categories. The forgotten children were no longer trapped in liminal suffering, but they remained present as valued members of a community that had finally learned to honor difference rather than erase it. Dr. Morrison, whose confession had initiated the entire process of revelation and healing, spent his final years documenting the ongoing relationships between the living and the remembered dead. His work became foundational for the emerging field of memorial psychology, which studied the ways in which communities could maintain healthy relationships with deceased members while acknowledging the specific harms that had been done to them during life. Mrs. Ashford, whose investigation had uncovered the systematic erasure campaign, became the garden's first caretaker, dedicating the remainder of her life to ensuring that the stories of the forgotten children were preserved accurately and completely. Her detailed records provided future generations with clear documentation of both the horrors that had been perpetrated and the healing process that had emerged from acknowledgement and memorial. The Whitmore family portrait, which had initiated the entire crisis, was eventually installed in a place of honor within the Garden of Remembrance, not as a celebration of family virtue, but as a permanent reminder of the dangers of allowing social pressure to override moral responsibility. Beneath the portrait was a plaque that read, "In memory of Margaret Whitmore and all the children who were deemed unworthy of being remembered. May their stories serve as a warning against the temptation to erase those who challenge our ideals of perfection." The garden became a pilgrimage site for families and communities throughout the region who had discovered their own histories of systematic erasure and memory manipulation. The techniques developed in Millfield for acknowledging and healing from such crimes were adapted and implemented in dozens of other locations, creating a network of memorial spaces where the forgotten could find peace and the living could learn to honor the full spectrum of human existence. Today, more than a century after Margaret Whitmore was erased from her family's portrait and memory, the Garden of Remembrance continues to serve its original purpose. Visitors report ongoing encounters with the children who were once forgotten, though these interactions have evolved from expressions of pain and demand into opportunities for teaching and healing. The ordinary family portrait that had seemed to represent domestic perfection had revealed the extraordinary evil that can result when societies choose to erase rather than embrace their most vulnerable members. But through the long process of acknowledgement, memorial, and ongoing relationship, it had also demonstrated humanity's capacity to heal even the most profound spiritual wounds through courage, honesty, and the determination to remember rather than forget. The missing child in the Whitmore portrait had been found at last, not through restoration to physical life, but through recognition that existence transcends the boundaries of memory and death. and that true family includes all its members, regardless of their perceived worthiness or social acceptability. The end-own portraits taken, fearing that the process might somehow make them vulnerable to being erased if they were ever deemed imperfect or inconvenient. The crisis deepened when several families reported that their children had begun deliberately injuring or disfiguring themselves, apparently believing that if they made themselves imperfect, like the forgotten children, they might be able to see and communicate with them more effectively. Parents throughout Millfield found themselves dealing with children who had become obsessed with the concept of being forgotten, some expressing the desire to be erased themselves rather than live with the knowledge of what had been done to others. Mrs. Ashford, whose investigation had uncovered the systematic erasure campaign, found herself at the center of a community-wide trauma that seemed to be growing rather than healing. The more people learned about the extent of the memory manipulation, the more they questioned the authenticity of their own recollections and experiences. "We have opened a door that perhaps should have remained closed," she wrote in her private journal. "In seeking to restore the memory of the forgotten children, we have destabilized the entire community's relationship with reality itself. People no longer trust their own minds, their own memories, their own perceptions. We have traded the specific horror of erased children for the general horror of universal doubt about the nature of truth itself." The situation reached its most critical point when investigators discovered that the memory manipulation techniques had been used not only to erase inconvenient children, but to implant false memories that served the interests of Millfield's elite families. People began remembering charitable acts that had never occurred, business dealings that had been more generous than they actually were, and social interactions that painted the prominent families in more favorable lights than reality had warranted. The revelation that their positive memories of the community's leaders were as artificial as their forgotten memories of the erased children created a complete breakdown in social trust. Citizens began questioning every interaction they had ever had with authority figures, wondering which of their experiences were genuine and which had been carefully crafted through psychological manipulation. Dr. Morrison, overwhelmed by the scope of the crisis he had helped create, made a desperate decision to attempt a radical intervention. Working with specialists in hypnosis and memory recovery, he proposed a community-wide process of systematic memory restoration that would attempt to undo all the artificial alterations and return people's recollections to their original, unmanipulated state. "We must face the possibility," he announced to a gathering of community leaders, "that the only way to heal from this crisis is to experience the full truth of what was done, regardless of how painful that truth might be. We must recover not only our memories of the forgotten children, but our authentic memories of everything that was changed to serve the interests of those who sought to reshape reality according to their preferences." The process that followed would become known as the Great Remembering, a systematic attempt to restore authentic memory to an entire community that had been subjected to decades of psychological manipulation. The procedures were conducted in groups, with participants supporting each other as they recovered increasingly disturbing memories of complicity, deception, and moral compromise. As the artificial memories fell away and authentic recollections returned, the full scope of the horror became clear. The systematic erasure of disabled children had been only the most dramatic example of a broader campaign to reshape social reality according to the preferences of a small group of wealthy families. Elections had been influenced through implanted memories of candidate qualifications. Business dealings had been obscured through artificial recollections of fair treatment. Even marriages and social relationships had been manipulated through carefully crafted false memories of romantic attraction and social compatibility. The community that emerged from the Great Remembering was fundamentally different from the one that had entered it. People who had lived their entire lives believing in artificial versions of reality found themselves confronting authentic memories that were often painful, complicated, and morally ambiguous. The comfortable certainties that had defined Millfield's social structure dissolved as residents recognized how thoroughly their perceptions had been manipulated. But perhaps most significantly, the recovery of authentic memory allowed the community to properly acknowledge and mourn the children who had been erased from their recollections. Memorial services were held for Margaret Whitmore and the other forgotten children, creating the public recognition and remembrance that had been deliberately denied to them during their lives. The famous family portrait that had started the entire crisis was finally recognized for what it truly was, not a celebration of family virtue, but a monument to family shame and community complicity in systematic oppression. The image that had once hung in places of honor was removed to storage, though some argued it should be displayed as a permanent reminder of the dangers of allowing social pressure to override moral responsibility. As 1886 drew to a close, Millfield was beginning the long process of rebuilding its social institutions on a foundation of authentic rather than manipulated memory. The crisis had taught the community that the price of false perfection was the erasure of human dignity, and that any society built on systematic forgetting would ultimately destroy itself through the contradictions inherent in denying reality.